total number of Japanese in Los Angeles, 43, or appears in Japanese ancestry, must have been a few soldiers back on leave in American Army uniform, and I think someone had the statistic, 20 women of Japanese blood who were married to Caucasians. And this was the total, but that didn't prevent. Jap Army invades L.A., and this was seriously carried by the newspapers of May. But just to show the ultimate good sense of the people, J. Parnell Thomas in 1948 was not only defeated for re-election, but put in the federal penitentiary. What little good news we have in this sad story comes out of those elections. Now we come to 1944. Oh, I forgot. Another great leader of this thing, because this was a way to discredit Roosevelt, was our Democratic congressman from the Wilshire district, John Costello. And John Costello was another one who constantly baited Dillon Meyer, who stood up bravely. Dillon Meyer came to the House Un-American Activities Committee sessions there and fought Costello. But that Costello, what happened to him? Well, in the June 1944 Democratic primary, Costello was beaten by the votes of the people of the Wilshire district. And then finally, in November of 1944, Roosevelt beat Dewey, and from then on, things start to relax. First Tuesday in November is the re-election of Roosevelt for the third term. The Endo decision is December 17th. I was in Washington and was tipped off that this decision was coming, so that the tip came from Abe Fortas, who is now a justice of our United States Supreme Court. He was then Undersecretary of the Interior. He told me so that I could alert the officials of California that they were shortly going to be confronted with the internees were going to return, that the Japanese were going to come back and reclaim their property, and that California officials should pretty well look alive to seeing that this was carried out. And I had the tip just a few days. The decision came down on December 17th. Endo, I think, was decided a day or so before the decision, but the proclamation dissolving the exclusion order came on December 17th. By early 1945, persons of Japanese ancestry and also of Japanese birth were returning. In January of 1945, we had the first atrocities, the first acts of vigilantism committed against the returning Japanese. That was in Placer County. And I called the sheriff of Placer County and said, what are you going to do about it? He said, I'm not going to do anything about it. If Roosevelt sends those people back here, he can come here and protect them. I called Warren and I said, we've got to turn out the State Guard. And Warren came to my side. He issued a blast against this sheriff. The interesting thing is, during all of that time, there were only two sheriffs who, because as Attorney General I was officially in command of the sheriffs, there were only two sheriffs who defied me and my requests that they protect the returning Japanese. One was this sheriff up in Placer County, and another was the sheriff in Orange County. But don't snicker. Do you know what? The people of Orange County beat that sheriff at the 1946 election. And the people of Nevada County beat the sheriff of Nevada County in the 46 election, and those were the only two sheriffs. And believe me, political longevity looks greater in sheriffs than any other public officer. But there were only two incumbent sheriffs rolled out that year, and those were the two who had taken such abominable positions on the matter of fighting vigilantism. I just one recollection, because I go on for a long time. We went to work. I put my small investigative staff to work on the vigilantes. We got interested citizens to offer rewards who were leading the arrest and conviction of anybody, particularly around Fresno and Selma. There were these scare shootings. It so happened that on VJ Day, August 15th, I was touring the area around Selma and Fresno County with my chief investigator, former chief of police of Bakersfield. And we were going through these homes of the returnees where you could see where a rifle bullet had gone right through a house, entry bullet, exit bullet, and a sleeping child within inches. And but it was the 15th of August. VJ Day had occurred. It was the most exciting experience, I think, of my life, to be there with these people, because this was the greatest news that they'd ever had, that this damn war was finally over. And the end of they trusted the end of that persecution was at hand. You know what we found out there? We had a case just about built, that most of those drugstore cowboys who were engaged in that vigilantism were getting their leadership from the village banker. And the village banker was a man who had been trusted by the Japanese as they were leaving for the camp. He had been their faithful steward. But you know, when they were coming back, they were saying, "Where's my property?" and so on, and they were getting very equivocal answers. And also, it was this bird, this banker, who was the fellow who was back of the vigilante activity to frighten these people. We had a direct economic cause and effect. This is why I'm so interested how this thing did get whipped up and why it was still being whipped up. And this banker, we just about had a case ready to take the grand jury. And one of those unfortunate things that happens to a prosecutor, a higher court intervened. The banker had a heart attack and died. And we never had a chance to expose the economic roots of this thing. Well, thank you.
We all thank you very much, Judge Kenny, for a really unique insight into the circumstances of the evacuation and its aftermath. Now, I've got some questions I'd like to ask our two speakers, but I have a feeling that you do too. So I think I'll give the audience first priority. Oh, yes. Would you please stand?
Both.
Los Angeles or Santa Monica?
The answer is both.
Yes, ma'am.
To the economic basis for the Japanese
strange thing was I was chairman then of the Senate Small Business Committee. It was always getting confused. There was an un-American activity of the state that called which was called the Little Dies Committee, and Assemblyman Tenney was chairman of that, and they asked me once up in San Francisco newspaper, are you Tenney of the Little Dies Committee? I said, no, I'm Kenny of the Little Guys Committee. Anyway, we had a hearing up in Petaluma, I think it was, and all of these associated farmers who would represent the most regressive elements of our community came there and protested the evacuation. Why? Well, they needed, the Japanese were the only people who could determine the sex of a one-day-old baby chick. This profession were known as chicken sexers, and with all of the chicken, you see, the great thing in the chicken world is the feminine sex. Males are an economic disaster, and so if you spend a lot of time in feed raising a chick and he grows up and turns out to be a rooster, he's a dead loss. He doesn't lay any eggs. So this was the hot foot that we had given ourselves by evacuating the chicken sexers, and so the Associated Farmers came around on that.
Dr. Daniels, I think you had something to comment on the economic foundation of anti-Japanese prejudice.
Yeah, the economic side of this, like the report of Mark Twain's death, are greatly exaggerated. This is one of those things that people like to be able to put off on somebody else. It was those people, who got their property. But let's count a minute, There were 110,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, a great number of whom were women and children. While a great number of these people were farmers and did have property, there wasn't that much farm property. And certainly there were avaricious individuals. There are people always ready, as we all know, to take economic advantage of any disaster, man-made or natural. But the idea greatly prevalent in California circles, and I've met this from a number of people who say, well, it's all those people, over in the valley who wanted the farm. This is a way of shoving the, look, this thing was one of the most popular things that happened in California. And if it had ever been put to a national referendum, it, of course, would have done so. There were people who made a long career of anti-Japanesism. I hate to disagree with my very distinguished co-panel member, but especially on matters involving race discrimination that become a matter of public concern, I must say unequivocally that I have a much lower estimate of the judgment of the sovereign people than does the judge. And I think our entire history is evidence of this. And I don't think we have to stop in 1942. I mean, this is a continuing thing, and I must say that I find no evidence in recent election statistics that the general racial tolerance of the general California population has very, very much improved, Proposition 14, and certainly I'm sure that we can overstate these things. Now, the Ford-Rogers election, Will Rogers Jr. won for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons was that even in those pre-television days, he had a very, very nice image. He was, after all, the son of a very, very famous man, and by the way, just this business of electing public personalities is not just a Republican phenomena, although it seems to be actually here in California. It started, as a matter of fact, with liberal Democrats getting involved in various Roosevelt campaigns. I don't know about the Orange County sheriff, but from everything I know about Orange County, I would not. I would likely to guess that the man who replaced him would not likely to be number one on the ACLU hit parade.
Professor, I can let you in on a secret. Yeah. It ought to be established that the man who beat that sheriff was a big USC football star named Jim Music.
Well, on the same point, of course, it is customary in talking about the evacuation to enumerate the long list of liberals who either actively supported the evacuation or who didn't oppose it, names like Earl Warren, Walter Lippmann, Justice Douglas. I think it's fair to raise the question at this point, what kind of opposition, what kind of vocal opposition to the evacuation was there? Who, if anyone, in the United States in 1942 did oppose this? You care to comment?
Well, and by the way, it's very, very few people. I guess the best example is that the Southern California branch of the American Civil Liberties Union, headed by A.L. Weirin, did oppose it. The National ACLU, who's willing to defend anybody, including Gerald L.K. Smith at that time, would not take a stand. I don't think anything more dramatically illustrates the way that the American conscience was numbed, because in most things, and since its formation in the post-Palmer raid hysterica of World War I, the National ACLU has been the spokesman for almost all the people oppressed by the law. They wouldn't do this. The Southern California branch certainly must go on top. Norman Thomas, who's in his long career probably been involved in more public good works and on the right side of more questions than any other Americans, was against it. A number of liberal Protestant clergymen, mostly many of the Quakers, a number of others, I don't want to do it. A few California newspapermen, including, and I think this is really fantastic, an example of growth, and I see his man who will be his biographer is in the audience, Chester Rowell, who had been one of Hiram Johnson's brain trusters and who had been one of the people who helped shape the Alien Land Acts in 1913. Chester Rowell, writing in the Chronicle, was against it. There were a number of other individuals who raised a voice protest, and I don't want to say that this is an exclusive list, and I haven't attempted to do so, but they were a very, very tiny minority of the population, and they were heard on a national scene only very, very late in the war. As a research project, and I don't say this is definitive because this is based on the work, on the admittedly incomplete work of students, but one of the places where I suspected there would be a great deal of opposition was in what is usually called the Anglo-Jewish press, the publications of various Jewish synagogues in English. This student didn't read either Hebrew or Yiddish. She looked and she looked and she looked in everything available here. She found nothing until late 1944, a week before Endo, and it happened to be a guest editorial by a Quaker. So that even on this limited sample, but focused on most of the representatives, at least of Southern California American Jewry, American Jews who one would suspect of all the people would have been most highly sensitive. You get in the Negro press of the time, you get a very interesting kind of schadenfreude. They are aware of this. But in some of the editorials, and this is based on an incomplete study, I hope to there's almost a sort of hidden glee. It's terrible what they do to colored people in America, but boy, isn't it good that it's them and not us. Americans as a whole, and both Negroes and Jews, of course, are Americans, were in these years, let me underline, terribly insensitive. They were just about ready to write the Japanese out of the human race. And I think that only if we understand that they were essentially unpersons to most Americans, will we understand this thing.
I agree. I just could add one or two names to the list. The Unitarians were pretty good on this, as well as the Quakers. Wayne Collins, the civil liberties attorney in San Francisco, along with Al Weirin, were really brave men and lost a great deal, I'm sure, of their clientele by taking a stand against the evacuation and for the rights of the evacuees. And then I remember being gratified and quite surprised to notice that Homer Crotty of the firm of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, and certainly a conservative Republican and not a libertarian, I can assure you, but Homer Crotty spoke out against this. But you can count them on the fingers of both hands.
One last question, I'm afraid. Concerns the readiness of the concentration camps perhaps to be used again, whether this is a likely possibility. Perhaps this is best discussed in our final session this afternoon, but would you care to comment on this, Dr. Daniels?
Well, I feel like, one of these hooked up panel shows. I'm glad you asked me that. Let me read you a clipping in its entirety, because these are closed files. They won't let me see them. This is from the New York Times of the 6th of May, 1962. But a clipping, AP clipping, datelined Washington the 4th of May, and the headline is, 6 camps for Reds set up, then closed. And I'll read you the clipping in its entirety, and those of you who know anything about the wartime camps will pick up one or two familiar echoes. The government had 6 camps ready to confine American communists in case of an emergency, but they were abandoned or turned to other uses 5 years ago. That's in 1957. We don't know when they were written. The Attorney General's office, although the now Senator Kennedy was Attorney General when I wrote, refused to answer, just ignored this letter and lost it. They didn't answer it. So I can't find out when they were set up, but they were apparently abandoned in 1957. But they were turned to other uses 5 years ago, the Justice Department's report. The Department's comment yesterday was in reply to charges of 2 alleged Communist Party leaders, Benjamin Davis and Gus Hall, that the government had, quote, concentration camps, end quote, to confine what they, this is Hall and Davis, termed hundreds of thousands of persons to be prosecuted under the 1950 Internal Security Act. Mr. Hall and Mr. Davis have been indicted by a federal grand jury on a charge of failing to register as Communist Party officials under the Act. The Federal Bureau of Investigation estimates that there are 8,000 to 10,000 Communist Party members in the United States. The camps were at Avon Park, Florida, Allenwood, Pennsylvania, El Reno, Oklahoma, Tule Lake, California, and Wickenburg and Florence, Arizona, etc. Now they're doing other things. I wouldn't be surprised if this were to happen. I would be very, very much surprised if it would be ethnically.
Something like the Bobbsey twins up in Manzanar, and who I think is probably most responsible for my being here, was going to tell something, or was going to lead the way, but since I'm asked to comment on what I was doing at the time of evacuation, I go back, if I might, to a little, to a time previous to that. I recall if any of you who are in the audience were around here in 1932 on the Westwood campus, I recall that during my undergraduate days here at UCLA, as a major in political science, I had the opportunity to be a first-hand witness to what I think was really a prelude to mass evacuation. That is, in my senior year, I recall that I offered to work as a volunteer to help Dr. Ordine Rocky as 16th District Congressman. He was then chairman of the Political Science Department at UCLA, and he had seen fit to help me meet what small expenses there were in attending this institution then by allowing me to be a reader in his department. So when I learned that he was running for Congress, with great enthusiasm, I rushed into his headquarters and offered my services. His opponent at that time, John Dockweiler, drew a pretty good bead, or at least his campaign headquarters did, and to my horror I discovered that my support was a terrible burden to Dean Rocky, because bright circulars and 120-point headlines said, "Professor Rocky has support of Japs." Dockweiler won. I think that the 1942 mass racial evacuation was the logical culmination, I think, as Professor Daniels and Judge Kenney have pointed out, was the logical culmination of forces that were long at work in this state. And while we've had the overview and the bird's eye view from Professor Daniels and a pretty good side view from Judge Kenney, let me give you a worm's eye view from the place where I think those of us were caught in this in 1941 and 42 as we saw it. I went to work as an English editor, in quotes, for the Los Angeles Japanese Daily News nearly a year before I received my BA here at UCLA. And in the 6 years that I spent there, I think I began to learn the meaning of schizophrenia and paranoia in the life of the Japanese American racial minority in the pre-war days. The Japanese daily newspaper, then and now, has 2 front pages, an English and a Japanese. And my first job was to translate from what is called Romaji, that is Japanese written phonetically in English, the shortwave news dispatches from Tokyo via the government news agency of that day, Domei. And so in reasonably readable, polite, stilted English, I typed such well-worn phrases of that day as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and I put a good face on Japan's brand of pre-Pearl Harbor militarism, as any good son of a samurai was supposed to do. My knowledge of Japanese was extremely limited to the ability to recognize the meaning of these words in Romaji. I could not write. As a consequence, in 1941, in October, as the clouds of war threatened, my boss asked me to go to Washington, D.C., and to meet with the Department of Justice to find out whether, when war came, we would be permitted to publish as a foreign language Japanese daily newspaper under the Espionage Act of 1917. I accompanied a gentleman who was then president of the Central Japanese Association and went to Washington, D.C. One of my co-workers at that time is in the group here. She was a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and was on the editorial staff. And she and I will recall that in a brief period before Pearl Harbor, this was in October and November of the months before December 7th, I had the opportunity to meet with Attorney General Francis Biddle in his office. And as the English editor and representative of the Los Angeles Japanese Daily News, took him the rather, to him, startling request that when war comes, you're going to allow us to continue to publish. And to my surprise, I received that evening at the Wardman Park Hotel where I was staying a rather brief message that I should report the next morning to the Munitions Building War Department. And this interrupted a carefully planned schedule that I had had for calling on congressmen and hoping to meet some people on Capitol Hill later that day. I went to the House Munitions, the Munitions Building, and was detained there for the better part of a full day. To my enlightenment, I discovered a gentleman who said he was in charge of G2 Army wanted to know what plans we had been making through the pre-war years using the Los Angeles Japanese Daily News as an agency for the Japanese government. And they had apparently documented and had photo slides of most of the significant Japanese section and English section editorials. And as I sat there benumbed, or at first a little bit puzzled, I was asked whether or not I'd written this editorial or this one, and when I denied I could read the one on the right because it was in Japanese, they gave me a very literal translation and explained to me that they were mutually contradictory, that on the one hand, the editorials to the left represented a typically American point of view on a current political issue of the day. The one on the right was strictly Japanese. And this, I think, as a consequence of this, on my return to Los Angeles on the day after Pearl Harbor, I was arrested on a presidential warrant with no writ of habeas corpus. My wife and family did not know, as was the case with most people who were interned or arrested on the day of Pearl Harbor or after. I was gone for 11 days and then released, and from there, of course, went to Manzanar. I think this pretty much, if I offers a background, as I recall it, to what I was doing at that particular time.
Might be appropriate in talking about the evacuation to give a sort of prelude from the viewpoint of the Japanese American, a viewpoint of the Nisei and the Issei. Perhaps I can illustrate that best by giving the story of an irate employee who went to the paymaster and he said, "Looky here, I'm $1 short in my pay envelope." The paymaster checked it over carefully and said, "That's right, you are short. Let me look at the record. How is it that 1 week ago when we paid you, we overpaid you $1? Why didn't you say something then?" And this employee said, "An occasional error I can forgive, but two in succession, no."
Very good.
For a brief few moments, I would invite you to put on a Japanese skin and look through the major community through the eyes of a Nisei and Issei. And over the years, this is a prelude, let us say, to the evacuation. These are some of the psychic barriers, psychic wounds, if you may use a term, which he encountered. In the purchase of insurance, for example, life insurance, the Japanese were told by the major insurance companies that the only kind of insurance they could buy was endowment insurance. Why is that? The Japanese don't live as long. Their mortality table is such that we can't sell them term or ordinary life. There was a denial in places of public accommodation. Perhaps the Nisei in this audience can remember when they were denied to public swimming places. The only places they could go to in a theater was nigger heaven, to use, if that term is excusable in this context, which was the balcony, restaurants, barbershops. Sometimes denied them service. One of the most cruel barriers was the denial of citizenship to the Japanese born in Japan, ineligibility to citizenship, which was very briefly lifted when a handful of World War I veterans, upon discovering that they could not obtain citizenship by reason of service in World War I, although the law said so, asked the JECL, and the JECL, Japanese American Citizens League, in 1936 did secure an enabling act. There was the inadmissibility to the United States As you know, in 1924, the Exclusion Act went into force. What did that mean to the Japanese here? That meant that some of the students here who had married, or businessmen who had come over as treaty merchants, children, perhaps marrying a Japanese a Nisei wife, on the conclusion of their term of entry, the condition of their entry into the United States, suddenly found themselves subject to deportation. And because they were an inadmissible race, there could not be recourse to the law wherein they could be forgiven and allowed to obtain suspension of deportation. There were the alien land laws in some 12 western states wherein Japanese could not own land.
But here was a kicker. In the California law, Section 9A declared that where an Issei made a payment of any kind to assist in the purchase of land, the land therefore became escheated to the state of California. It's what you call a statutory presumption of violation. You must remember that at the time of Pearl Harbor, there were approximately 70,000 American citizens, their average age 19. And so in the purchase of land for agricultural purposes or for residence, where they bought property, the property was bought in the names of the American citizen. But the presumption always existed, and this was later enforced upon our return. The land was subject to escheat. There was a denial to membership in labor unions. There were denials of license to the Issei to become lawyers. Some of our distinguished genro or elder statesmen in our local community are law school graduates, but because they were ineligible to citizenship, they couldn't become lawyers. Surveyors, pharmacists, pilots of vessels, bartenders, registered nurse, notary public, collection agent, private detective, public school teachers, domestic fish breeders. Now, the Japanese had started the propagation of goldfish, but it was felt that this constituted a danger to the public health and police powers of the state of California, so a law was passed to prohibit them from breeding goldfish. They could not become insurance brokers or agents, horse racetrack operators, CPAs, real estate brokers, and salesmen. They were denied employment in federal, state, or city civil service. They could not receive the old age pension. They could not vote or hold office. This is, in brief, a recital of some of the psychic barriers that the Japanese Americans encountered in their effort to gain full participation in the community.
In the short time I have, I will tell something of myself and of my relation to the evacuation, so you can get my first-hand impressions and have some basis to evaluate my observations and comments on the panel. I learned about Pearl Harbor on coming out of the Orange Grove Friends meeting in Pasadena on Sunday noon. We were at that time residing in Porterville, California, in the San Joaquin Valley, and my wife was soon to become pregnant with our first child. I was working as an employment interviewer with the California Department of Employment. You've had already a very comprehensive and clear and forceful account of the events leading up to it. I recall very well that the evacuation did not come immediately after Pearl Harbor. We knew that the FBI had picked up individually anyone remotely suspected of being pro-Japanese in sentiment, and which meant anybody who had made a business trip or had sent a child to be educated in Japan. These were investigated, and I believe many were soon released. Some months later, the press, and particularly the Hearst press, as I recall, began to whip up anti-Japanese American sentiments, claiming acts of sabotage, The main argument offered, as I recall, was that in the event of evasion of the West Coast, it would be hard to distinguish the enemy from American Japanese. Now, my friends who were left of center or pacifists believed then, as Judge Kenney does now, that the associated farmers were after the Japanese Americans' farmland. The order for the evacuation was printed in the newspapers, given over the radio, and printed placards were posted on the telephone poles. The date for it was set somewhat ahead, as I recall, but very few people left the West Coast voluntarily during this interval between the announcement and the date set for the evacuation. I think there are three possible reasons for this. One is that most people simply did not believe that the evacuation would ever really actually be carried out. It was so contrary to the American tradition, and nothing of the kind had ever been done before. Two, some felt it would be dangerous to live in the outside open part of the country. And then three, many did not have the money to move and were not willing to give up their homes on such short notice. Now, although I am of the white majority group, I am part of a minority with respect to my beliefs about the necessity for the evacuation. My friends and I strongly believe that the evacuation was unnecessary, undemocratic, and based on racial prejudice. But I think the majority of the population felt that it was necessary. We knew there had been no acts of sabotage. We knew the Japanese in Hawaii were not being evacuated, and we knew certainly that Americans of German or Italian descent on the East Coast were not being evacuated. To be consistent, they should have been evacuated from the East Coast too. Well, we did what we could to try to get the evacuation order rescinded. Obviously, we're not successful. And then, through the American Friends Service Committee, did what small amount we could to make the evacuation easier for the people involved. We brought picnic lunches and spent some time with friends in the Tulare Assembly Center. That phase was not mentioned, which was in the Tulare County Fairgrounds. Stables were used as places for people to sleep at that time. And then we brought food for the evacuees to take with them on the train trip to the relocation center. One anecdote to illustrate the ambivalent feelings of the population. My wife and I were shopping in the supermarket produce department and overheard a lady shopper commenting to the clerk after observing how much produce had gone up in price. Quote, "It's too bad those damn Japs had to leave." End quote. Some months later, I learned of an opportunity to go to work in one of the relocation centers as a part of the paid staff, who were called the appointed staff. I debated with myself whether I should associate myself with the evacuation in any way, and consulted with my friends about this. I decided to accept the position, and we stayed in Topaz, Utah for 18 months. Now, I could reminisce for hours about life there. It was a very good life in this period for my wife and myself and our baby. We had some friends in camp, as we call it, when we came, and we made many others. The administration generally was opposed to social relations between the appointed staff and the residents, as they were called. Initially, we had a large barrack room with a pot-bellied stove. This room became quite a social center in Topaz. Our record player got a workout. Later, we had a conventional apartment. Well, I'll skip that. Just on the side, housing was assigned to staff on the basis of seniority and not size of family. And as you can imagine, the senior people had children who were already grown and needed less space, but they got more. The appointed staff were made up, I think, of three kinds, at least they can be categorized into three classes. There were some chronic, or shall I say, permanent temporary government agency employees who moved from one temporary agency to another, and the War Relocation Authority was simply one of these temporary agencies. A number were local Utah people, mostly Mormons, of varying degrees of competence, from complete competence to overtly psychotic. The third group, which included myself, I guess, were persons who, for idealistic reasons, wanted to try to alleviate the situation. Now, our idealism was often frightening to many of the residents who were generally closer to the conservatives of the, or were more like the persons who had prompted their evacuation than the Quakers and other queer people who came to the camp to try to alleviate some of their distress. A few observations on the centers. Of course, there is no storm that doesn't blow some good. On the positive side, in the high school, for example, for the first time, Nisei had an opportunity to assume all of the positions of leadership in student government, to take part in dramatics in all roles, not just the Japanese servant, to be editors on the school paper, etc., as well as to take part in athletics. And in passing, Dr. Kitano, at that time he wasn't doctor, he was Harry, was president of the senior class and was voted the most popular boy. On the negative side, there was... Why was that funny? All right. Pause first. All right. On the negative side, there was a marked deterioration of parental authority and family life. Older children were not dependent on and tended to lose respect for their parents. After the war, when the camps were to be closed, some families said, "We didn't want to come here in the first place. Now that you brought us here and took away our means of support, you can take care of us." Another positive effect, before the evacuation, many professionally trained people, unable to find employment at their highest level of training, were able to do so after resettling away from the West Coast. For example, one of our friends was trained as an architect. He had to work as a draftsman before the war. He went to Detroit from Topaz and was hired as an architect by the City Planning Committee. Now he has his own architectural firm in the Bay Area. Another friend was a dentist who had to work as a technician before. Afterwards in Chicago became licensed and was able to practice as a dentist. I think it was only a few months after the evacuation took place and the population was moved to the relocation centers that these centers were gradually opened and evacuees were encouraged to resettle anywhere in the U.S. except on the West Coast. In fact, the government opened a number of relocation offices in all of the larger cities of the Midwest and the East to facilitate this process. And here I might observe that in any bureaucracy, in order to achieve the goals of the organization, you oftentimes have to violate the rules. And that was the case in Topaz, where all official letters had to be signed by the director of the project. And we were involved in arranging school admission, housing, and jobs for people. And if we were to follow the correct channels, these letters would be too late to achieve their purpose. So those who were concerned about helping resettlement violated the regulation by writing personal letters instead of official ones and putting their own postage on it. We left Topaz, time is short, I'm sorry. We left Topaz to direct a relocation hostel in Philadelphia, a non-government charitable project sponsored by the Philadelphia Council of Churches, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and a specially formed organization called the Citizens Committee to assist the War Relocation Authority. Generally, we were not happy with our experiences in Philadelphia. There was a very competent older Japanese couple who served as cook and maintenance man. Our job, that is my wife and I, was to correspond with people who were coming out of the centers, to counsel with them and to assist them in relocating and also to do the marketing. But our concern was that there not be another little Tokyo set up in Philadelphia. But we had difficulty in getting the hostel residents to act friendly toward Negro visitors who wanted to be friendly to them. In fact, we had to import our Nisei friends who are not residents in the hostel to come in to be hosts to meet the visitors, both white and Negro, who came. Then we were very much concerned about, as we still are, about integration. However, our board was not sympathetic to us. They liked to come to visit the hostel and to see the Nisei girls wearing kimonos, etc. The International Institute there established a separate Japanese group, just as they had groups for Lithuanians, Poles, etc., etc. Now, the argument they used was that we should respect and support Japanese culture. Well, that's fine with me. But what were these groups of young Nisei doing? They played bridge and listened to jazz records. As was pointed out earlier, the question now is, can it happen again? And I think it can, but again, as was pointed out, I don't think it will be on racial basis, and it's quite conceivable that those who are opposed to the present war, which I feel has strong racial aspects, the bomb was dropped on Japan, not on Germany. The people in Southeast Asia are also damned Asiatics, and they are also yellow-skinned. But I think that if the war becomes hotter and is declared again, I would likely be back in the camp, but not in the privileged position of being on the staff, but being one of the internees. Thank you.
During the years that these events were taking place, I was a soldier in North Africa and Italy, and so I'm the one member of the panel that was not personally involved in the evacuation in any way. I think they've invited me to say a few words about the economic life of the camps. And I'd like to first mention that during the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, there was a great deal of talk about the importance of giving priority to human rights instead of to property rights. A distinction was made between these kinds of rights. Well, not only in this episode were human rights forgotten, but property rights as well. And I wanted to give you just 2 or 3 statistics about that. The families who were involved in the evacuation had equities in about $200 million in property of various kinds. This included about 250,000 acres of farming land, about 20,000 automobiles, about 7,000 businesses, and of course homes and furniture, artworks, bank accounts, and so on. Property built up at great sacrifice over many years. The evacuees were expected to dispose of this property quickly and individually. Each person was permitted to take with him only what he could carry in his hands, and the government agreed to provide for the storage of property only at the risk of the owner. In thus disposing quickly of their property, the persons were victimized by the unscrupulous. Furnishings that were valued at hundreds of dollars were sold in documented cases for as low as $4 or $5. Homes and farms were sold in documented cases. The homes and farms worth many thousands of dollars were sold for less than $4 or $5. Ultimately, the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco was assigned the responsibility of storing personal property, and the Office of Alien Property Custodian managed their businesses, and the Farm Security Administration was given the task of managing and disposing of their farms. But these did not prevent huge losses, and by the end of the war, that is, by the time that the relocation took place, at the closure of the camps, the number of Japanese American-owned or leased farms had dropped from 7,000 to 2,000, the total acreage from 250,000 down to about 25,000. And it's estimated that the amount of property loss of all American Japanese attributed to the evacuation, not counting money they could have earned, but simply actual direct loss, at about $350 million. One other point that should be mentioned is with regard to the camps themselves. The War Relocation Authority took from the very beginning the attitude that they should attempt as quickly as possible, in the light of public opinion, to relocate outside the centers as many of the internees as possible. And furthermore, they were limited by Congress and public opinion on the pay that could be paid persons on work projects. They wanted to have work projects to keep the people busy, to utilize their skilled manpower. It was needed in the war effort. And they wanted the internees to be able to demonstrate by constructive deeds that they were loyal Americans. But Congress placed an absolute limit that none of them could be paid more than the American private was paid, which at the time was $21 a month. And when Congress raised this limit from $21 a month to $50 a month, the War Relocation Authority did not see fit to increase its own pay scale because it didn't want any incentive on the part of the people to remain in the camp. It wanted to give every incentive for them to get located outside as quickly as possible. And so they set up a scale of $16 for most labor, $19 for skilled labor. In addition to that, in the case of younger persons, $12 a month where they were undergoing vocational training. So $12, $16, and $19. Doctors, surgeons, school teachers, accountants that were employed in the administration of camps were given the $19 figure. In addition to that, they provided cash allowances at rates that varied from $2.25 a month for children to $3.75 a month for persons over 16. This was to cover the cost of clothing and other costs of that nature. They did distribute some GI clothing left over from World War I to workmen for work clothes. In the case of people who were unemployed, they gave unemployment compensation payments of $3.25 a month for adults, $2.75 for a wife, and $1.50 for each child. This was for persons unemployed through no fault of their own. When a person worked outside the camp for nearby farmers, businessmen, or for government depots on a seasonal or short-term basis, they were to be paid, the internees doing this work were to be paid the standard camp rates of 16, 12, 16, and 19, but the employer was required to pay the going wage in the community, and the difference between what the internee earned and what the employer paid went into a general fund to be used for the benefit of the camp. And this is how they supported some of their recreation centers, schools, libraries, and other activities. All of this, you must understand, occurred at a time when the American workmen who were doing construction jobs in the camps or had equivalent jobs to these in civilian life were getting from $150 to $250 a month. Just one other point about their economic life. The government insisted that they attempt in every way to be as self-sufficient as possible in providing their food and other consumables. This was virtually an impossibility because they were settled in places on which nobody had ever been able to make a living. But nevertheless, they were able to provide in all of the camps roughly 1/5 of all of the food which they consumed. This included poultry, beef, swine, projects of this nature. In the camp in Utah that was already mentioned, this was accomplished on land which was known as the Big Alkali Flat of Millard County, and it was accomplished despite the fact that all but 250 in the 10,000 who lived in the camp were urban people, only 250 farmers in the group. But they were able to provide huge quantities of food, vegetables, and meat. I think maybe that's all I ought to.
Okay, I think... thank you very much. I think what we should do is now to open up the panel for any kinds of questions. While you're thinking of a question, let me just indicate that if you've ever seen a cantaloupe this size, well, that's what the Japanese farmers were able to grow in the great alkali flats of Utah. Fantastic. Yes.
I'd like to direct this question to Mr. Masalka and
just in case people you can't hear, I'll just try to paraphrase it anyway. The question has to do with, did the Japanese articulate any sort of resistance to the evacuation orders?
Joe? Well, before you do, let me point out, as Judge Kenney and Professor Daniels were recounting the chronology of executive orders out of Washington and out of the general headquarters in San Francisco, I remember in February, and this was in mid-February, after the executive order, apparently after the goose was cooked, at the Rafushimpo, we received a telegram inviting us, that is, to send a representative of our newspaper to Sacramento from Governor Colbert Olson, saying, please come to Sacramento at our own expense. So I recall taking the train up to Sacramento on the evening that Japanese submarine shelled Goleta, and getting into Sacramento and meeting with a number of the representatives of the Japanese American Citizens League. And here we sat, I think, as I recall, about 25 of us, in this large office with this white-haired gentleman, the governor of California, sitting there and calling on us as good, loyal American citizens to cooperate with civil and military authorities in this great emergency, because, he said, as I look at you, I can tell whether a German or an Italian is a loyal American, but Japanese, I can't tell. And therefore, I call upon you to demonstrate your loyalty and be prepared to evacuate, to close your businesses. And he went right down the line. And I remember as we came out of that meeting and tried to recover our wits, Walt Tsukamoto, who was then, I believe, national president of the Japanese American Citizens League, as we retired to a chop suey parlor to see whether or not we could figure out exactly what the governor had been telling us, simply said, well, it looks like they're going to give us the business. Of course, we didn't know until 2 weeks later that the die had been cast. But under those circumstances, I think that all efforts that we made in Los Angeles, as some of us did, because I know the various elements of the Japanese community, that which was left leaderless after the FBI and the Navy intelligence roundups in the first week of the war, that they organized things like the Anti-Axis Committee and they raised funds for bombers and for ambulances. That is, for those who are a little bit squeamish about raising funds for bombers, we had an ambulance fund. We brought the dissident factions of the Japanese American Citizens League and their critics and all of the church groups and this very highly organized Los Angeles community. And I recall one particular mass meeting under the name of the Civic Federation or some such name at the Maryknoll Hall, at which all of the various people who had some said, "We will fight it." I think the strongest expression that evening was from either Kei Sugahara or Joe Shinoda, both businessmen, who said that if this is really something that the national security requires, this was Kei Sugahara as I recall, then let us cooperate. But if it means we're just giving in to a bunch of politicians, let's fight. Well, what could we do? Joe Shinoda simply said that let's fight, as I recall. But there were funds gathered and there were efforts made, but here was a leaderless community with the people who really counted and whose decisions would weigh, left without real leadership in a situation that appeared to be impossible. I don't think any effective effort was made to prevent evacuation by the community itself. Now, Joe may or may not agree. Incidentally, too, I've never known whether you got paid $16 or $19.
Well, I was a fruit stand worker, Togo, and not being in the newspaper profession as you were, he didn't think that I was worth the $19 I believe you got.
Well,
So
no, I did not get. Now, you'll recall we both we delivered them. We delivered the Manzanar Free Press. We didn't write for it.
Well, I assumed that you got the 19 because you were usually buying the soda pop. To answer your question intelligently, I think it would be worthwhile going into the earlier years. As Nisei, I remember those of us who went to Japanese school, our parents felt that there was such a gap, generation gap, that they ought to bridge it by at least having their kids be able to talk a little bit more than kitchen Japanese to them. And so we were encouraged to go to Japanese school. Japanese schools were attacked as instruments of subversion. I still remember the newspaper pros and cons on the subject. The Buddhist church was also seen as an instrumentality of the Japanese expansionism. The birth rate at that time we were growing up, and the Japanese women that came over from Japan were of the age when they were most, I was going to say fertile, but the most childbearing period. And these statistics of birth were magnified out of proportion, just like, as you had heard earlier, Professor Daniels tell you. There were all these things in the past that was a part of our heritage of growing up, I guess. Then, in the years when Japan was expanding rather rapidly, I was a chapter president of the Japanese American Citizens League, and we met periodically, had so-called district council meetings. I remember at one meeting, a Captain Kaniga of Navy Intelligence was there, and he spoke convincingly of the way the Nazis took Norway, and that there was this kind of an element within our community. At another meeting, Captain Zacharias, later Admiral Zacharias, actually stunned our group by saying, undoubtedly there may be some loyal Japanese, but there are spies among you people, and you people know who they are, and your unwillingness to report them is a black mark against you. This kind of conditioning led us to believe that, well, maybe there was a considerable subversive element among Japanese, of which we didn't know. Some secret organization. They used the word Heimushakai, which we as Nisei didn't figure out until later the Attorney General defined it for us. This was the Veterans Association. There were sinister names like the Black Dragon Society. Well, actually, Black Dragon Society is refers to the Amur River, and there are some Japanese who believe that perhaps Japan itself might expand in that direction. They were supporters of that belief. Well, there were supposed to be extensive branches of the Black Dragon Society, and these names rang rather in a mysterious and sinister fashion to our ears. Now came Pearl Harbor. Togo has mentioned some of the things that took place. At first we were overwhelmed at the expressions of solicitude that appeared in the press. Public officials, mayors, and governors said that we're in a war with Japan. We have American citizens of Japanese ancestry and their parents here. We ought to accord them every principle of fair play and justice. Then later on, after that initial lull, things started to happen, beginning from about mid-January. There was some talk about evacuating Japanese. We went to school. You mean put us behind barbed wires? Why, that's impossible. We have certain constitutional rights. There are certain things that are guaranteed to us in the Constitution that are set forth in the Declaration of Independence. We certainly believe those. And then when the evacuation order came, certain responsible leaders of the Japanese American Citizens League saw what had occurred at Terminal Island. In a 48-hour period, people had to abandon or liquidate their personal possessions. Their fathers had been picked up and interned. Mothers and children were there. I remember the JECL had to send out trucks to help these people get out there. They put them and they slept on church benches. There was a threat that a similar evacuation would take place. In fact, Colonel Bendetson speaks of it in the Commonwealth, in a speech before the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco in May, in which he describes that if there was the least bit of resistance, such a precipitate and hurried removal of the Japanese would take place. Well, seeing what had occurred in Terminal Island and in certain other areas which had been evacuated on such short notice, and the fact that it was being urged upon the only functioning national organization, which was the JECL, that as a measure of their cooperation in terms of national security, that there should be cooperation with the evacuation movement. Now I think of Sadakichi Hartmann, who was half German and half Japanese, who went out in the Mojave Desert and refused to be evacuated, and I guess he convinced the military authorities. But any who had more than 1/8 blood Japanese was evacuated. I know that Wayne Collins, a friend, said the biggest trouble with you people was that you should have all taken out writs of habeas corpus. 117,000 writs of habeas corpus. Imagine, Joe, that would have snarled the entire governmental machinery. Well, that's good to talk about in retrospect, but the actuality of the situation was that NOAA was in a position to effectively fight. This is on the part of Japanese Americans.
I just wanted to mention, Harry, that there's documentation for this point of view in the camp newspaper in this Topaz camp. Trek was the name of their newspaper. And there are two illustrations of this. One of them is when they were sending out a group of students to colleges and universities, mostly in the Midwest, an editorial was published by Lillian Ota, in which she gave this advice: "It won't do you or your family and friends much good to dwell on what you consider injustices when you are questioned about evacuation. Rather, stress the contributions of these people to the nation's war effort. Mention the number of Nisei in the United States Army, the way the Manzanar Boy Scouts protected the American flag from a pro-Axis mob, how the evacuees are engaging in wartime agriculture, and you will do the Japanese in this country more good than talking about discrimination." The other documentation is a story which reveals the notion that it just couldn't happen to us. One of the children of an evacuee family said to her mother, "Mother, I don't like this place. When can we go back to the United States?"
Yes.
There were, I think, about 8 or 9 Japanese daily newspapers on the West Coast: Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. Not sure whether the one in Portland was daily or not. And these newspapers were primarily supported by the Japanese reading first-generation Japanese. They all had appendages, English sections, that were not an economic self-supporting entity, but they were generally included because in most families you had living under the same roof the parents and the second-generation children. And I think that with the exception possibly of a weekly newspaper in Los Angeles, which was reputed to be communist, and which I don't really know whether it actually was, that these newspapers generally represented and reflected a very conservative pro-Japanese government point of view. And I think this is understandable in the light of the fact that for the most part the Issei Japanese in this country legally were sojourners. They were not permitted to be residents. I thought it was rather interesting that Judge Kenney made reference to some of the public relations efforts made by a Japanese community in Florin, California. I had the privilege during a period in Chicago after I was released from the relocation camp to do some writing and data compiling for the University of California's Evacuation and Resettlement Study, and the Florin community in Sacramento